The name he never escaped. The lights inside the studio were brighter than he remembered. Not harsher, just unforgiving. They exposed everything. The nerves, the hesitation, the tiny tremor in his hands as he adjusted the microphone stand. From the shadows behind the curtain, Dean Martin watched. He had stood on hundreds of stages, maybe thousands. He had faced presidents, packed theaters, rooms full of skeptics, rooms full of worshippers. Applause had followed him for most of his life like a loyal echo. But tonight, for the first time in decades, his chest felt tight in a way no audience had ever caused. Because tonight, the man standing under those lights wasn't a guest. It was his son. The producers called it a special appearance. The audience thought it was a surprise. Dean knew better. Nothing about this was accidental. From the moment the band finished their warm-up and the cue cards were stacked neatly on the podium, Dean felt the weight of something unfinished pressing against his ribs. He took a slow sip from the glass beside him. Water, not whiskey. He hadn't touched alcohol before a show in years, but old habits still haunted the set like friendly ghosts. 5 minutes, a stagehand whispered. Dean nodded, his smile already forming out of instinct, the smile that had sold 1,000 jokes, the smile that hid more than it revealed. But tonight the smile felt rehearsed. He glanced again toward the curtain. His son stood with his back straight, shoulders tense, pretending not to notice the audience noise leaking through the walls. He wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention. It was the kind of outfit chosen by someone who didn't want to be accused of riding anyone else's fame. Dean noticed that immediately. Of course he did. The boy, no, the man, had grown into himself quietly. Too quietly, maybe. Years earlier, Dean had tried to convince himself that distance was protection. Fame was a storm, and fathers, he told himself, weren't supposed to drag their children into storms. So he stayed busy. Tour, films, records, television. He was always working, always providing, and always telling himself that love didn't need constant proximity to be real. But watching his son now, Dean felt a thought he hadn't allowed himself in years rise uninvited. What if I mistook absence for sacrifice? The studio lights dimmed slightly. Showtime. The band struck the opening notes, smooth and confident. The applause rolled in like a practice tide, and Dean walked onto the stage with his familiar ease. The crowd roared. He waved, cracked a joke, slipped effortlessly into the rhythm that had defined his public life. From the outside, nothing was different. From the inside, everything was. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dean said, pausing just long enough for the applause to settle, "we've got a special show tonight." The audience leaned in. They always did when he used that tone, half playful, half sincere. "There's a lot of talent in this business," he continued, "and sometimes it runs in families." A ripple of laughter. Dean felt his pulse quicken. "And tonight," he said, "I'd like to introduce someone who doesn't need my name, but got it anyway." That line wasn't on the cue card. The bandleader glanced over, surprised. Behind the curtain, his son froze. The applause swelled as the curtain parted. For a split second, father and son locked eyes. And in that silent exchange lived decades of unspoken things. Expectations, regrets, pride that had never quite found the right words. As his son stepped forward, the applause softened into curiosity. The audience saw the resemblance immediately, not in the face exactly, but in the posture, the way he carried himself, the restraint. Dean studied him like a stranger, and like a memory at the same time. He remembered teaching him to ride a bike. Remembered missing his first recital. Remembered sending gifts instead of showing up. All of it surfaced at once. His son approached the microphone, clearing his throat. He didn't look at Dean, not yet. "Good evening," he said, voice steady but careful. "It's an honor to be here." Dean waited. The cue card suggested a light exchange, a joke, a smooth transition into a musical number. But Dean didn't move on. Instead, he stepped closer. Close enough that the cameras caught the moment, but not close enough to steal the spotlight. "You nervous?" Dean asked gently. A pause. "Only a little," his son replied, Hard not to be. The audience chuckled. Dean didn't. Funny thing about stages, Dean said. They don't care who your father is, they only care if you're honest. That wasn't planned either. The band was ready. The song was chosen carefully, something classic, something safe. But before the music began, Dean raised his hand. Hold on, he said. The studio fell quiet. Even the musicians paused. Dean turned fully toward his son. For a long time, he said, voice lower now, I thought the best thing I could give you was distance, space, freedom. His son looked at him then, really looked. And tonight, Dean continued, I realized something. The director gestured frantically from off stage. Dean ignored him. I never asked what you needed. Silence. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that makes truth unavoidable. Dean swallowed. This stage made me, he said, but it also took things from me. His son's eyes glistened, though he didn't move. And if you're standing here tonight, Dean finished, it's because you earned it, not because of me. A breath. A tremor. The audience didn't clap. They didn't dare. The band finally began to play. Soft, respectful. His son sang. And in the first few notes, Dean heard something he hadn't expected. Not imitation. Not rebellion. But identity. The voice wasn't his. It didn't need to be. It carried restraint where Dean's had swagger, control where Dean's had charm, and something else, something quieter. Vulnerability. Dean felt his throat tighten. He had spent a lifetime commanding rooms. Tonight, he was barely holding himself together. As the song reached its final line, Dean felt tears gather, not for the performance, but for the years he could never replay. The applause erupted, louder than before. His son exhaled, relief and disbelief crossing his face. Dean stepped forward again, placed a hand on his shoulder, and leaned into the microphone. There's something I should have said a long time ago, Dean said. His voice cracked. Just slightly. Enough. The studio went completely still. And whatever Dean said next, whatever words finally crossed that distance, would change both of them forever. The silence after the applause. The applause didn't fade the way applause usually does. It didn't roll away like a wave returning to the ocean. It lingered, awkwardly, almost intrusively, like it didn't know whether it was welcome anymore. Dean Martin stood still, his hand resting on his son's shoulder longer than necessary. Too long for television. Too long for comfort. The cameras caught it all. What they didn't catch was the tension running through that simple touch, the years of absence packed into a single moment, pressing harder than any spotlight ever could. Finally, the director's voice crackled through the studio speakers. And cut to commercial. The red light blinked off. Just like that, the magic dissolved. Backstage was quieter than the stage had ever been. The walls seemed narrower here, the air heavier. Dean walked ahead, instinctively leading the way, the same way he always had, assuming others would follow. His son trailed a few steps behind, unsure whether he was meant to keep pace or create distance. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence had plenty to say. A production assistant hurried past them, eyes wide, whispering to another crew member, "Did you see that?" Dean pretended not to hear. His son heard everything. Inside the dressing room, Dean closed the door gently. No slam, no drama. That alone felt unusual. The room smelled faintly of cologne and old wood, familiar, comforting, and suffocating all at once. Awards lined one wall, framed photos lined another, smiling faces frozen in time. None of them showed moments like tonight. Dean loosened his tie, then stopped. He didn't remove it. He turned slowly. His son stood near the door, hands folded in front of him, posture respectful but guarded, like someone waiting to be dismissed. Dean noticed that too, and it hurt more than he expected. "You did good," Dean said finally. "Simple, safe. Too safe." His son nodded, "Thank you." Another silence. Thicker this time. Dean walked toward the mirror, stared at his reflection. He looked older up close, not just aged, weathered. The man staring back had laughed his way through decades, but laughter, Dean realized, didn't erase the lines. It only disguised them. I meant what I said out there, Dean added, about you earning it. His son shifted his weight. I know, he replied. Then after a pause, that's why it surprised me. Dean turned. Surprised you? Yes, his son said carefully. You don't usually say things like that, not publicly. There it was. Not accusation. Not anger. Just truth. Dean exhaled slowly. Public was always easier, he admitted. Crowds don't ask questions back. His son's jaw tightened. I did, he said, when I was younger. The words landed softly, but they landed. Dean felt something inside him crack. Not break. Crack. The kind of fracture you can ignore for years, until pressure finds it again. I didn't know how to be both, Dean said, a father and this. He gestured vaguely, as if his career could be summed up with a wave of the hand. His son took a step forward. You never asked, he said. You decided. Dean flinched. I thought I was protecting you. From what? His son asked quietly. From you. The question wasn't cruel. That somehow made it worse. Dean opened his mouth. Closed it. Sat down. The chair creaked under him, reminding him how tired he actually was. You know, Dean said, rubbing his palms together, people think confidence comes from applause. He looked up at his son. It doesn't. It comes from knowing where you belong when the lights go off. His son's eyes softened, but only slightly. And where did you think I belonged? He asked. Dean didn't answer right away. He couldn't. A knock interrupted them. 2 minutes, someone called from outside. Dean nodded, even though the door was closed. The show would resume. It always did. Life didn't pause just because something important was happening. His son broke the silence. I almost didn't come tonight, he confessed. Dean's head snapped up. Why? Because every time I step onto a stage, his son said, I'm not fighting nerves. He hesitated. I'm fighting your shadow. Dean swallowed. I never wanted that for you. I know, his son replied, but intention doesn't erase impact. That sentence hit harder than any headline ever had. Dean stood up slowly. Walked closer. For the first time, he didn't position himself as the host, or the star, or the authority. Just a man. I don't know how to fix what I didn't notice breaking, Dean said. His voice was rough now. But I want to try. His son searched his face, looking for something. Sincerity, consistency, proof. I'm not asking for a performance, his son said. I've seen enough of those. Dean nodded. Then don't clap, he said softly. Watch. The studio lights flickered on again outside. The band began tuning. Time was running out. Dean reached for the door, then paused. One more thing, he said without turning around. His son waited. I'm proud of you, Dean said, not because you stood on my stage. He finally turned. But because you didn't disappear trying to please me. The words broke something open. His son's composure cracked, just enough. His eyes filled. He looked away quickly, embarrassed. Dean didn't comment. He didn't need to. When they walked back onto the stage together, the audience sensed it immediately. Something had shifted. This wasn't just television anymore. This was unfinished business being handled in real time. And Dean knew. Whatever he chose to say next, whatever he chose to admit, would either close the distance forever, or finally bring them face to face, the thing he never said. The band played softer than before. Not because they were told to, but because they felt it. Even the musicians knew this wasn't just another segment. The rhythm slowed, the notes spaced farther apart, as if the music itself was holding its breath. Dean Martin stood at center stage. His son stood a step behind him. The cameras framed them together now, no longer separate shots. father and son in the same frame, an image millions would later pause, rewind, and analyze. But what mattered wasn't what the audience saw. It was what Dean remembered. There had been a night, many years ago, that looked nothing like this. No lights, no applause, no music, just a phone ringing in a quiet room. Dean had been on the road then, moving from city to city so fast that hotel rooms blurred together. That night, the phone rang just as he was loosening his tie after a show. He almost didn't answer. Almost. On the other end was a voice too calm to be good news. His son had been young, too young to carry the weight he was already carrying. There had been trouble at school, a fight, a suspension, words spoken out of anger and misunderstanding. Dean remembered gripping the phone tighter than necessary, listening without interrupting, nodding to himself even though no one could see him. "I'll handle it," he had said finally. But he never explained how. Dean had sent money instead. Letters instead. Distance instead. Now, standing under the lights decades later, that memory surged forward with painful clarity. Dean realized something that made his chest ache. That night hadn't changed his son's life because of what happened at school. It changed it because Dean hadn't shown up. Dean. The voice pulled him back to the present. Live television. The host's chair waiting. The audience watching. Dean blinked. "Sorry," he said lightly, slipping back into his familiar charm. Got lost in the music. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But his son knew better. As Dean sat down, he felt the weight of a decision pressing against him. There was something he had never said. Not to the public. Not to his family. Not even to himself. And if he didn't say it now, he knew he never would. The host smiled, sensing the tension but unsure why. "Well," the host said, "this is certainly a memorable night." Dean nodded. "Yeah," he said, "for me too." He turned to his son. "You remember when you told me you didn't want to sing anymore?" His son stiffened. The audience leaned forward. "I do," his son replied cautiously. Dean nodded slowly. "I thought it was a phase," Dean said. "Kids have phases." He paused. "But it was." His son's hands clenched. "No," he said quietly, "it was." Dean inhaled deeply. "That was the night I told you maybe you should find something safer," Dean continued. "Something quieter." The words sounded harmless out loud. They hadn't been then. They weren't now. His son's voice trembled just slightly when he responded. "You didn't say maybe," he said. Dean's throat tightened. "I said it wasn't for everyone," his son continued. "That not everyone is built for this life." The audience shifted uneasily. Dean closed his eyes for a brief second. "I was talking about myself," Dean said. Silence fell hard. "I just didn't know it." That was the truth. The one he had never admitted. He had been afraid, not for his son, but of seeing himself reflected back with all his mistakes exposed. "I didn't want you to hate this world the way I sometimes did," Dean said, "so I tried to push you away from it." His son looked at him, really looked at him now. "And did it work?" he asked. Dean shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it just pushed you away from me." The audience didn't clap. They didn't breathe. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was confession. "I almost quit," his son said suddenly. Dean's head snapped up. "What?" "I almost quit everything," his son repeated. "Music, performing, all of it." Dean felt his heart pound. "When?" "After you said that," his son answered. "I figured if I couldn't earn your respect, maybe I didn't deserve anyone else's." Dean's composure shattered. He stood abruptly, abandoning the chair. "That was never," he started. Then he stopped, because denial would only make it worse. "I'm sorry," Dean said. Not the casual apology. Not the public one. The real one. "I was wrong," he said, voice breaking, "and I didn't realize how loud my silence was." His son's eyes filled despite his efforts to hold steady. That's the thing about fathers, his son said. Even when you're quiet, we hear you. Dean stepped closer. The cameras zoomed in instinctively. I can't give you back the years I missed, Dean said, but I can stand here now and tell the truth. He looked straight into his son's eyes. You were never the problem, Dean said. My fear was. The words hit like a release valve. His son's shoulders sagged, the weight finally shifting. The band softly resumed, unsure whether to stop or continue. Dean didn't notice. All he could see was his son. I don't need you to fix the past, his son said. I just needed to know it wasn't my fault. Dean nodded, tears now visible. It wasn't, he said firmly. It never was. The host cleared his throat awkwardly. Well, he said, forcing a smile, this has certainly become something special. Dean turned. No, he said gently, this has become something honest. The audience erupted, not in cheers, but in something deeper. Recognition. Dean placed a hand over his son's heart. Whatever happens after tonight, Dean said, know this. He paused. I see you. His son finally broke. Tears fell freely now. Not because of the cameras. Not because of the crowd. But because for the first time, the words had arrived. But there was still one thing left. One final choice. One last moment that would define everything. And Dean knew. The hardest part wasn't confessing the past. It was deciding what to do after the truth was spoken, when the lights went out. For the first time that night, Dean Martin asked for the cameras to stop moving. Hold it right there, he said calmly. The director hesitated. This wasn't in the rundown. Dean didn't look back. He didn't need to. His voice carried the authority of someone who had built this world long before most people in the room were born. Just hold, he repeated. The cameras froze. The band went silent. And suddenly the studio felt smaller, like a living room instead of a stage. Dean turned to his son. Not the audience. Not the host. Not the millions watching at home. Just him. You know, Dean said quietly, people think the hardest part of fame is getting it. A soft, knowing murmur moved through the crowd. It's not, Dean continued. The hardest part is figuring out who you are when it no longer impresses anyone. His son listened, eyes red but steady now. I spent years teaching myself how to entertain strangers, Dean said, but I never learned how to stay present with the people who mattered most. The words weren't dramatic. They were deliberate. And that made them devastating. Dean took a breath. There was a moment, he said, when I realized I might lose you. His son stiffened. Dean nodded. You don't know this, but there was a letter you wrote me. The audience leaned in. You never sent it, Dean continued, but your mother did years later. His son's breath caught. Dean reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The studio went absolutely silent. I carried this for a long time, Dean said, holding it up, not opening it yet, because I was afraid that once I read it out loud, I wouldn't be able to hide anymore. The host shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer television. This was something else entirely. Dean looked at his son. Do you remember what you wrote? He asked. His son shook his head slowly. Not exactly. Dean nodded. You said you weren't angry. That surprised everyone. You said you understood that I was busy, that I was trying, that you didn't want to be a burden. Dean's voice wavered. And then you wrote one line that broke me. He unfolded the paper. His hands trembled. I wrote, Dean read, if you ever wonder why I stopped calling, it's because I didn't want to interrupt a life that didn't seem to have room for me. The sound that followed wasn't applause. It was collective heartbreak. Dean lowered the paper. I didn't answer that letter, he said, and that was the greatest failure of my life. His son stepped forward instinctively. Dad. Dean raised a hand gently. Let me finish, he said, please. His son nodded. I spent years being loved by the world, Dean said, and all the while I was losing the one person whose love I never earned back. He swallowed hard. So tonight, I'm not asking for forgiveness. The audience stirred. I'm asking for permission. Dean turned fully to his son. Permission to show up, he said, not as a legend, not as a name. His voice cracked. But as your father. The silence stretched. Long enough to be terrifying. Long enough to be real. Dean didn't move. Didn't smile. Didn't perform. For the first time in his career, he waited. His son wiped his face. Took a shaky breath. Then spoke. I spent a long time thinking I had to earn a place in your world, he said. Tonight, I realized something. Dean looked at him, afraid to hope. I don't need your world, his son continued. I just needed you to step into mine. Dean nodded, tears streaming freely now. I can do that, he whispered, if you'll let me. His son stepped forward and hugged him. The audience rose as one. Not cheering. Standing. Honoring. The cameras finally moved again, but gently now, respectfully. Dean closed his eyes, holding his son like he should have years ago. Not tightly. Just present. Later, long after the show ended, after the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, Dean sat alone in his dressing room. The mirror reflected a man who looked lighter somehow. His son stood in the doorway. You coming? He asked. Dean smiled. Yeah, he said, I am. He stood, turned off the light, and for the first time, the darkness didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of something honest.